Today, Mike Pompeo did what none of his predecessors dared or even wanted to do. He stepped foot onto an Israeli settlement, land the international community considers illegally occupied, land Palestinians say belongs to them. Like Pompeo's boss, President Trump, today's visit was provocative and in-your-face moment for Palestinians. Donald Trump began his presidency by swearing allegiance to America's pro-Israel policy, more precisely, the policy of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Palestinians have never been included in any Trump negotiations or decisions regarding the Middle East. But Donald Trump leaves office in January, and that leaves little time for more than last-minute legacy building, if that was indeed the purpose of Pompeo's visit. Could today's embrace of Israel be part of Donald Trump's planned 2024 political resurrection? Or could today have been a casting call for a future U.S. presidential candidate named Mike Pompeo?
It's a first for Israeli-American relations and a parting gift from America's outgoing top diplomat. Mike Pompeo's visit to the Golan Heights makes him the first U.S. Secretary of State to visit the disputed territory since Israel seized the region in 1967. The United Nations may have rejected the annexation, but for Pompeo and the Trump administration, this is Israeli land.
You can't stand here and stare out at what's across the border and deny the central thing that President Trump recognized that previous presidents had refused to do, that this is a part of Israel and a central part of Israel.
In another unprecedented move, Pompeo made a stop to an Israeli settlement in the West Bank, angering some Palestinians who say it legitimizes what they view as illegal Israeli settlements. The Secretary of State had no scheduled meetings with Palestinian leaders. Some have called the trip a victory lap of sorts, a chance for the Trump administration to highlight what it sees as its diplomatic success in the region, including taking steps to legitimize Israeli settlements.
For a long time, the State Department took the wrong view of settlements. It took a view that didn't recognize the history of this special place. And instead, now today, the United States Department of State stands strongly to the recognition that settlements can be done in a way that are lawful and appropriate and proper.
A stance that puts the U.S. at odds with many international bodies, and that could prove to be a stumbling block for incoming President-elect Joe Biden.
And for more, I'm joined tonight by a respected voice in the geopolitics of the Middle East. Trita Parsi is an award-winning author who has written several books on U.S. foreign policy in the region. He's also Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Trita, it's good to have you back on the day. Let's look at what Mr. Pompeo did today. A visit to the occupied Golan Heights and then a visit to an Israeli settlement in the occupied West Bank. What was Pompeo trying to do today?
Well, we can only speculate, and I think your reporting has already suggested that this could very much be part of a desire by Pompeo to boost his own bid for 2024 and maybe to be able to boost Trump's second bid. All of those things are valid speculations in my view. What we should not be forgetting, though, is that regardless of their intent, this is going to have real and frankly devastating consequences for the region as well as for U.S. security, because these are measures that is locking in the United States in a posture in the Middle East that makes it increasingly stuck and increasingly complicit in the illegal activities of some of its allies. And this is ultimately bad for the region and ultimately bad for the United States as well, regardless of the intent or the political motivation of Pompeo.
I want you to take a listen to what the Secretary of State said today about Iran.
Indeed, the commitment we've made, the ironclad commitment we've made to the Jewish state will continue. I'm confident that after our conversation this morning, we talked about how we can protect Americans and Israelis in the region from the regime in Tehran. You talked about this. They remain, we should not take for granted, they remain the foremost state sponsor of terrorism in all the world. And Israel has provided outstanding support to our pressure campaign, which we have no intention of relaxing.
So, Trita, how does Pompeo's message square with President-elect Joe Biden's intention to try to revive the Iran nuclear deal?
Well, Pompeo is doing absolutely everything he can to make sure that Biden's options are as limited as possible and that it does not lead to him being able to return to the JCPOA or in any other measure. And I think this is really critical. This is also what he is trying to do when it comes to moving the embassy to Jerusalem, recognizing these settlements, making these visits, because they're counting on the idea that Biden simply does not have enough political courage to reverse some of these policies that he himself deemed to be devastating for U.S. national security, but that he doesn't have what it takes to make sure that there's a pushback against it. Unfortunately, that calculation may be proved true, because when we take a look at what's been happening on the U.S.-Israeli front and the treatment of settlements, there has been a gradual acceptance of illegal settlements as something that the U.S. at first objected to, later on viewed as an obstacle to peace, later on became more neutral towards, to what we have right now, a complete embrace of illegal settlements and violation of international law. And I think in some ways, the Pompeo and Trump administration may have gone too far. They may have pushed it so far that Biden may have no choice to but really push back, even though he will likely pay a political price for doing so.
Do you think it's possible that Joe Biden could stay the course when it comes to accepting Israeli settlements, but really try to do a 180 with the policy on the Iran nuclear deal and try to revive that deal? Could he have both of these things happening at the same time?
He could. That's likely what's going to happen, because the political cost of reversing the policies on Israel are going to be higher than trying to go back into the nuclear deal. We should not forget that Democratic platform explicitly says that a Democratic president should be going back into the nuclear deal, and beyond that also negotiate further, having additional negotiations with Iran. There is no such language in terms of settlements, for instance. So I think the political price will be lower on the Iranian front. But I think what's really important to keep in mind here is that Democratic presidents all too often have ended up accepting the limitations and the framework that previous Republican presidents have imposed on them. We saw that as well when it came to how the Obama administration dealt with a lot of the legacies of the Bush administration. And the question is there enough political will to really actually have President Biden define his framework himself and define whatever limitations he has himself, instead of letting him be defined by President Trump or Secretary Pompeo?
Yeah, apropos definition and defining, Pompeo attempted to expand the definition of anti-Semitism today. Take a listen to what he said.
Today, I want to make one announcement with respect to a decision by the State Department that we will regard the global anti-Israel BDS campaign as anti-Semitic. I know this sounds simple to you, Mr. Prime Minister. It seems like a statement of fact, but I want you to know that we will immediately take steps to identify organizations that engage in hateful BDS conduct and withdraw U.S. government support.
Now, Trina, he's also talking about people who want to boycott Israel, not necessarily because they're anti-Semites, but he's saying he wants to consider them as anti-Semites. Is that going to have any legal leg to stand on in the United States?
It's likely going to be challenged by ACLU and a lot of other organizations, because this is a freedom of speech issue. On the one hand, Pompeo is imposing crippling sanctions on Iran that have been devastating for ordinary people, limited their access to medicine in the midst of a pandemic. And on the other hand, he's trying to say that even if individuals on their own voluntary basis decide that they don't want to buy oranges from Israel, then that suddenly turns them into anti-Semites. So there's going to be massive legal challenges to this, I'm confident. But what I think more than anything this shows is that you are now an administration that is just agreeing to whatever Bibi Netanyahu is telling them that they should be doing, because this is just a wish list of everything Bibi Netanyahu has ever wanted. And I think there's very few people anywhere that truly believe that Netanyahu's objective has been peace. And if the United States then is aligning itself with whatever Netanyahu wants and it's not wanting peace, well, that creates a major problem for the United States in the region. It's already been bad enough as it is, but it's going to get even worse going forward, I suspect.
Well, could this be a trap that that Pompeo or the Trump administration is laying for Democrats that are about to take power, because they can say then, if you're boycotting Israel, then you're an anti-Semite. And that's going to play well with evangelical Christians, for example, in the United States.
Absolutely. I mean, part of the plan here is very much to try to make sure that Republicans are seen as the pro-Israel party in the United States. Netanyahu has long given up on the idea that his closest allies in the United States would be the American Jewish community. The American Jewish community overwhelmingly votes for Democrats. They are overwhelmingly opposed to Donald Trump. They're overwhelmingly in support of the Iran nuclear deal. And they're very, very skeptical, if not opposed to settlements. So those are not his allies. His allies are evangelical Christians who actually have a theological affinity with Israel, one that is somewhat strange at the end of the day, because they envision that Israel needs to get strong in order for Christ to return. But at that moment, anyone who's not a Christian or is not converting to Christianity will be killed. But that is actually a very strong motivating factor for people like Pompeo, who is evangelical and who's been talking about these things quite a lot, at least prior to becoming Secretary of State.
So let me just ask you one more time. What do you think then we saw happening today? Was this early campaigning by Pompeo for president in 2024, or was he doing campaign work for Trump's fight to return to the White House in 2024?
I suspect this has more to do with himself than with Trump. I think this has very much to do with the fact that he wants to be the contender for the Republican nomination in 2024. He has always had an eye on it. And his main competitors are going to be people like Nikki Haley and others who also have a tendency of aligning themselves with Netanyahu. So I think this is an effort by him to give himself a leg up vis-a-vis that competition. The devastation for U.S. national security and the region as a whole is not even a second concern. I don't think it's a concern at all, unfortunately.
Trita Parsi, Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Trita, as always, good talking with you. We appreciate your insights. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Well, this week, the Palestinian Authority said it will resume its security cooperation with Israel. Now, that cooperation ended 6 months ago in protest against Israel's plans to annex large parts of the West Bank. Palestinians say settlements would undermine any possibility of establishing a Palestinian state. Israel claims historical and religious rights to the West Bank as the ancestral land of the Jewish people. Some say the Palestinian decision to resume security cooperation with Israel is in part a response to Joe Biden's election victory in the U.S. All right, let me pull in now Akram Baker. He is a Palestinian analyst based here in Berlin. He is a former communications advisor to the Palestinian Minister for Jerusalem Affairs. Akram, it's good to see you again. Pompeo met with no Palestinians today, and he said Israel has shown how Israeli settlements can be done legally. Your take?
Hi, Brett. It's nice to speak with you again. Look, Pompeo is not acting like a Secretary of State. Pompeo is acting like a pompous jackass who's pandering to the extreme right wing of the Republican Party. He's breaking every norm, rule, every regulation of international law and meeting with and going to an Israeli settlement. This man is only to be taken seriously as that he's dangerous, but his thoughts are so fringe, are so off the cuff and wrong that no one in the mainstream will accept it.
Well, let me ask you about what the Palestinians are thinking. The decision to revive cooperation with Israelis, is that because they have high hopes in President Joe Biden's Middle East policies and his Israel policy?
Look, I mean, we have to look at this from two things. First of all, the Palestinian Authority and Mahmoud Abbas is a spent force. It does not have any real legitimacy anymore, not among the Palestinian people. The only power it has is to somehow pay salaries to the people. The fact is that Joe Biden was elected President of the United States for a great reason, for deal by the progressive wing of the party. And I'd like to give a shout out to Stacey Abrams, what she did in Georgia. And the interesting thing is that for the first time, these progressives are not afraid to work for U.S. national interests, and that means challenging the right to Israel to occupy Palestine. And they have proven that this is not only not electoral suicide, that they have won by being able to say, we are no longer supporting the Israeli occupation week and forth, and they continue to get elected. Unfortunately, the Palestinian Authority is, as I said, a spent force. However, the PLO or some joint thing among the Palestinian people is not, and that's where I think it needs to move towards. I am completely against the security cooperation. I find it useless.
Well, tell me, Akram, who is Joe Biden then? Who should he talk to when he wants to talk with the Palestinians?
Look, first of all, I mean, what Joe Biden can do, there's quite a few things that Joe Biden can make. Very easy, very great changes which he can do, which will stride towards, shall we say, to correcting all of the wrongs committed by the Trump administration.
Yeah, but who should he call?
In the first 100 days of his administration. Well, of course he's going to call Mahmoud Abbas because he's there, but this doesn't mean that this is going to happen. I'm talking about the first 100 days. Of course he should call Mahmoud Abbas, but he needs to immediately, if he can reignite the funding to UNRWA, UNFDP, UNFPA, to support multilateralism, for the United States to come back into that, to reopen the PLO embassy. See, it's not a Palestinian Authority embassy, it's the PLO embassy in Washington. To call for the immediate halt of settlements, to restate that these are illegal under international law, to declare that it's illegal. These are simple things. These are simple wins that he could take, which fit into U.S. national security interests and long-standing U.S. foreign policy.
Well, we will see in about 2 months if that is indeed undertaken. Akram Baker joining us tonight here in Berlin. Akram, it's good talking with you. We appreciate your time and your insights tonight. Thank you.
Nice talking to you too, Brent. Thank you.